Uh, I'm Chuck Kern, Chairman of Kern & Company, PC, CPAs. I have about 50-some years in experience in public accounting and some years experience in industry. A number of years ago, in 2013, I put together this manual called Fundamental Concepts in Accounting and Income Taxes, Preparer and Users Edition. And in it, I present things that I think, concepts that I believe are fundamental. This does not constitute authoritative pronouncements from groups like FASB or the American Institute of CPAs, but these are my observations based on my experience. I wanted to let you know that if you would like to get a copy of this at the end of the segment, we'll give you some information where you can get in touch with us and request a copy, and we'd be glad to provide it. Today I'm going to talk about one of what I call the fundamental concepts in accounting, and that's the concept of materiality. Now, materiality is really a subjective thing. Very informally, I'll read you a very casual definition of materiality that I like. And I say something is material is any item in the financial statements or footnotes thereto that is material if it would make a difference to the user. Let me repeat that. An item in the statements and footnotes is material if it would make a difference to the user. Now, I have a more formal definition of materiality, but before I get into that, I wanted to share with you that materiality is, again, subjective. Now, some organizations like the Financial Accounting Standards Board, the Security Exchange Commission, in order to sort of regulate materiality, they oftentimes give a definition in their regulations that they say it is a set percentage, and they'll tell you what percentage, a set percentage of revenue or a set percentage of income, because that adds some formality and precision to it. But in fact, it is a subjective concept. So I want to share with you, first of all, I want to read to you a more formal definition of materiality. And the definition that I would encourage one to keep in mind is this. An item or an amount is deemed to be material if its incorrect presence or absence would cause the reader or user of the financial statements, including footnotes, to draw a misleading conclusion about the entity's financial condition or results of operations. Now that's a mouthful, so I'm going to read it again. An amount or item is deemed to be material if its incorrect presence or absence would cause the reader or user of the financial statements, including footnotes, to draw a misleading conclusion about the entity's financial condition or results of operations. Now, the reason I say footnotes are to be included, as well as the financial statements, generally accepted accounting principles, which we've heard that term many times, official pronouncements, official generally accepted accounting principles always tell us two things. They tell us how to account for something, and they tell us how to disclose that item on the financial statements or the footnotes. So the footnotes and the financial statements are both part of what we call GAAP, or generally accepted accounting principles. So I've worked up an example. Again, I made the comment or the observation that materiality it's a subjective thing, and it's not just a given percentage or amount. Let's take two examples. One, let's assume we have a small, closely held manufacturing firm, and let's assume that for 4 years they've had consistent revenues of around $3 million a year. So for 4 years, revenues have been around $3 million. And unfortunately, each of those 4 years, they've been showing losses of $200,000. So you have a company here with $3 million in revenues and a trend of losses that are certainly not good. Now, let's also assume in our example that in the 5th and 6th years, again, revenues of about $3 million. In year 5, a loss of $125,000, which is a lot better than the $200,000. And we'll assume in year 6 that the loss was $50,000. So you have 4 years, $3 million in revenue, $200,000 in losses. Year 5, $3 million, $125,000 loss. It's getting a little better. Year 6, $3 million in revenues, a $50,000 loss. So now we have year 7. And let's assume again that revenues are still around $3 million. So we have financial statements that show $3 million in revenues, and we're going to have 2 cases for this year. Let's assume in the first case that we have a loss of $20,000. Now, that's better than the 50 and the 125 and the 400, but it's year 7. Revenues are $3 million. The loss is $20,000. It's less than 1% of revenues. However, the users of the financial statements, the owners, if there are more than one, or the bank where they get their credit, I think the user might say, you know, it's a small amount of a loss, but it's still a loss. They haven't turned it around. Now, let's assume in a second version of this scenario that in the 7th year, again, revenues of $3 million, but let's assume instead of a $20,000 loss, there's a $20,000 profit. Now again, percentage-wise, it's less than 1% of revenue. But the users, I think, might then say, you know, it's small, but it's a profit, and it looks like finally they might have finally turned it around because they have this nice situation in recent years where the loss is shrinking and shrinking, and now it's a profit. So in this example, revenues $3 million, a profit or a loss of $20,000, which is less than 1%, even the swing of $40,000 in that example is only about 1% of revenues. But the reader or user could draw very different conclusions based upon the historic trend. So my point is, it's not, in terms of percentages, it's not a large amount, it's very small, between 0.5% and 1.5% perhaps. But in terms of the impact on the reader or the user, it could be a world of difference. Now I want to have another example. In that first example, you see there was it was a small amount, $20,000 on $3 million. But this example is a little different. Early in my career, back in the, I guess it was the mid to late 1970s, I had a very good experience of working for a firm that had been hired by the United States Army to do a review of the U.S. Army's accounting system for weapons procurements. So I remember one day we were there to design a new system for them for weapons procurement. But in order to do that, one of the things I needed to do was review the system they had. Their problem was that nobody was using that system. Well, at the time we did this work, there were pre-computer days. Well, it wasn't pre-computer days, but it was pre-monitor days. So I asked for a copy of the report that was generated by the system they had, and it came out on the computer, green bar paper, as they used to call it. And I knew right away why it wasn't getting used very much, because they brought the prior month's report out to me on a hand truck. It was like the printout was that big. So right away, that's one reason nobody's using it. But in the process of just trying to understand the flow, I wasn't there to do an audit. I just wanted to understand the flow of things. And there was a number on one page that was to flow to another page. And when I looked at it, it wasn't, the number wasn't the same, but it was supposed to be. So I took it over to our contact. Our contact was a man who had been a full colonel in the Army. He was now had a very high GS government rating as a civilian. And I said to him, I said, Jim, I know I'm not here to do an audit, but look at this. And he looked at the two numbers, and his response was, oh my God. So the next morning, I found myself in a meeting, and I was a young man, probably, I don't know, about 31. And the next morning, I found myself in a meeting with Jim, the Director of Finance and Accounting for the Army, who was a one-star general, the Comptroller of the Defense and Readiness Command, who was a civilian but had the highest civilian GS rating, and the Comptroller of the Army, who was a four-star general. And we were waiting in the waiting room outside the four stars office. And finally he came in and he said, okay, gentlemen, he said, I understand we're here to talk about a difference in numbers that are supposed to be the same and flow. He said, but I have a question for you before we get started. Are we talking about a difference of 3 million with an M or 3 billion with a B? Because if you people are bothering me about 3 million with an M, you're all fired. You see, at any one time, that man was dealing with 3 years' defense budget for the United States Army. So $1 million difference is a rounding error. And I said, no, sir, we're talking about 3 billion with a B. He said, all right, tell me what you got. So I told him what happened, and he excused me then from the meeting because I wasn't there to audit. I was there for another purpose. Now, I never found out to this day what the outcome was. But the point is that in my first example, $20,000 was a material number. In my second example, $3 million was not a material number, but $3 billion was. So I go back to the definition I read to you of a material amount. An amount or an item is deemed to be material if its incorrect presence or absence would cause the user or reader of the financial statement, including the footnotes, to draw a misleading conclusion about the entity's financial condition or results of operations. So the bottom line in ordinary accounting jargon is an amount is material if it would cause the reader or user of the financial statements to draw an incorrect conclusion. Thank you.